The Pearl, by Yukio Mishima. On December 10th, it was Mrs. Saki's birthday. She wished to celebrate the occasion with minimal fuss, and had invited only her closest friends for tea: Mrs. Yamamoto, Mrs. Matsumura, Mrs. Azuma, and Mrs. Kasuga, all of whom were the same. Age as the hostess, 43. These ladies were members of the Keep Our Age's Secret Society, and could be trusted not to disclose the number of candles on the cake. Mrs. Sasaki, demonstrating her usual prudence, invited only such guests to her birthday party out. For the occasion, Mrs. Sasaki wore a ring set with a pearl. Diamonds would have been in poor taste for a gathering of women alone. Moreover, the pearl matched the color of her dress better. As Mrs. Sasaki gave the cake a final inspection, the pearl in her ring, which had been a bit loose, finally dislodged. This was an ill-timed mishap for such a pleasant occasion, but it would have been inappropriate to alert everyone to the incident. Mrs. Sasaki placed the pearl on the edge of the cake platter and decided to deal with it later. Plates, forks, and napkins surrounded the cake. Mrs. Sasaki preferred not to be seen wearing a ring without a stone, while cutting the cake, and deftly, without turning around, slid the ring into a niche behind her. The matter of the pearl was quickly forgotten amid the excitement of gossip exchanges, and the surprise and joy the hostess felt from the thoughtful gifts of her friends. Soon the traditional moment to light and blow out the candles arrived. All gathered excitedly around the table, cooperating in the intricate task of lighting 43 candles. It was also expected that Mrs. Sasaki, with her limited lung capacity, would not extinguish so many candles in one breath, and her appearance of utter helplessness elicited several humorous comments. After the decisive initial cut, Mrs. Sasaki served each guest a slice of the desired size on a small plate, which each then carried to her respective seat. Considerable confusion ensued around the table as everyone reached out simultaneously. The cake was decorated with a floral motif and covered with pink frosting, liberally sprinkled with small silver sugar balls. The classic decoration for birthday cakes. In the initial confusion, some frosting flakes, crumbs, and a number of silver balls scattered on the white tablecloth. Some guests gathered these particles with their fingers and put them on their plates. Others, directly into their mouths. Then each returned to her seat, and with all the serene joy appropriate to the occasion, ate her portion. It was not a homemade cake. Mrs. Sasaki had ordered it in advance from a well-known confectionery, and everyone agreed that it tasted excellent. Mrs. Sasaki beamed with happiness. Suddenly, and with a hint of anxiety, she remembered the pearl she had left on the table. Discreetly, she rose as nonchalantly as possible and began to search for it. The pearl had vanished. She was sure she had left it there. Mrs. Sasaki hated losing things. Without further thought, she devoted herself entirely to the search, her unease becoming so evident that her guests noticed. "It's nothing 1 second, please," she replied to her friend's affectionate inquiries. Despite the ambiguity of her response, one by one, the guests stood up and examined the tablecloth and floor. Mrs. Azuma, confronted by such commotion, thought the situation was frankly deplorable. She was annoyed by a hostess capable of creating such an unpleasant situation over a missing pearl. Mrs. Azuma decided to sacrifice herself and save the day. With a heroic smile, she said, "That must have been it. The pearl must be what I just ate." When they served the cake, a silver ball fell on the tablecloth, and I picked it up and swallowed it without thinking. It felt like it got stuck a bit in my throat. Of course, if it had been a diamond, I wouldn't hesitate to return it, even at the risk of needing surgery. But since it's just a pearl, I can only ask for your forgiveness. This announcement immediately calmed the group's anxiety and saved the hostess from a difficult moment. No one cared to find out if Mrs. Azuma's confession was true or false. Mrs. Sasaki took one of the remaining balls and ate it. She commented. This one tastes like a pearl. Thus the small incident was received with jokes and, amid general laughter, was completely forgotten. At the end of the gathering, Mrs. Azuma left in her sports car, taking with her her close friend and neighbor, Mrs. Kasuga. Barely had they departed when Mrs. Azuma said, "You must admit it. You were the one who swallowed the pearl, weren't you? I wanted to protect you and took the blame." These informal words concealed deep affection. But as friendly as the intention was, for Mrs. Kasuga, a baseless accusation was a baseless accusation. She couldn't remember under any circumstances having swallowed a pearl instead of a sugar decoration. Mrs. Azuma knew how picky she was about food. A single hair in her plate was enough to choke her lunch. "But please," protested Mrs. Kasuga weakly, while studying Mrs. Azuma's face. "I could never have done such a thing. No need to pretend. I saw you at that moment. You changed color, and that was enough for me." Mrs. Azuma's confession seemed to close the birthday incident, yet it left an annoying aftermath. While Mrs. Kasuga pondered the best way to prove her innocence, she was seized by the doubt that the pearl from the solitaire might be lodged somewhere in her intestines. It was, of course, unlikely that she had swallowed a pearl instead of a sugar ball, but amid the general confusion caused by the chatter and laughter, it had to be admitted that there was at least that possibility. She mentally reviewed everything that had happened at the party, but couldn't remember any moment when she had brought a pearl to her lips. After all, if it had been a subconscious act, it would be difficult to remember. Mrs. Kasuga blushed violently when her imagination led her to another aspect of the matter. Having received a pearl into one's body, it is undeniable that, perhaps slightly diminished in luster by gastric juices, in a day or two it would be easy to recover it. Alongside this thought, Mrs. Azuma's intentions became transparent to her friend. Undoubtedly Mrs. Azuma had foreseen the same problem with discomfort and shame, and therefore, by shifting responsibility to another, had hinted that she bore the blame to protect a friend. Meanwhile, Mrs. Yamamoto and Mrs. Matsumura, who lived in the same direction, were returning home in a taxi. As the car started, Mrs. Matsumura opened her purse to touch up her makeup, remembering she hadn't done so during the entire gathering. When she took out her compact, a dull glint caught her eye as something rolled to the bottom of her purse. Feeling around with her fingertips, Mrs. Matsumura retrieved the object, and was astonished to see it was the pearl. Mrs. Matsumura stifled a cry of surprise. For a long time, her relationship with Mrs. Yamamoto had been far from cordial, and she didn't want to share this discovery, which could have such unpleasant consequences for her. Fortunately, Mrs. Yamamoto was looking out the window and didn't seem to notice her companion's sudden alarm. Surprised by the events, Mrs. Matsumura didn't stop to think about how the pearl had ended up in her purse, but immediately found herself trapped by her school leader's moral sense. It was practically impossible, she thought, to commit such an act even in a moment of distraction. But given the circumstances, the right thing to do was to return the pearl immediately. Otherwise she would feel a great pang of conscience. Additionally, the fact that it was a pearl, not too cheap nor too expensive, contributed to making her position more ambiguous. She resolved that her companion, Mrs. Yamamoto, should not know about the unexpected turn of events, especially when everything had been so well resolved, thanks to Mrs. Azuma's generosity. Mrs. Matsumura decided she couldn't stay in that taxi a minute longer, and, using the pretext of visiting a relative, asked the driver to stop in a quiet residential suburb. Once alone in the taxi, Mrs. Yamamoto was a bit surprised by Mrs. Matsumura's abrupt decision resulting from her joke. She observed Mrs. Matsumura's reflection in the glass, and, at that precise moment, saw her taking the pearl out of her purse. During the gathering, Mrs. Yamamoto had the first to receive her piece of cake. She had added to her plate a silver ball, that had rolled onto the table, and upon returning to her seat before the others, she noticed that the ball was a pearl. The moment she discovered it, she conceived a malicious plan. While the other guests were preoccupied with the cake, she slipped the pearl into the purse that the hypocritical and unbearable Mrs. Matsumura had left on the neighboring chair. Alone in the residential neighborhood where taxis were scarce, Mrs. Matsumura was plunged into dark reflections about her position. Firstly, even though it was absolutely necessary for her conscience, it would be shameful to stir things up again when the others had gone to such lengths to resolve matters satisfactorily. On the other hand, it would be worse if, by doing so, she brought unjust suspicions upon herself. Despite these considerations, if she didn't hurry to return the pearl, she would waste a unique opportunity. If she waited until the next day, the mere thought made Mrs. Matsumura blush, the return would give rise to doubts and speculations. Mrs. Azuma herself had hinted at this possibility. Then, with great joy, Mrs. Matsumura conceived a master plan that would put her conscience at ease, and at the same time free her from the risk of exposing herself to unjust suspicions. She quickened her pace, and upon reaching a busier street, hailed a taxi and instructed the driver to take her to a well-known pearl shop in Ginza. There, she showed the pearl to the seller and requested one slightly larger and of better quality. Once the purchase was made, she returned to Mrs. Sasaki's house. Mrs. Matsumura planned to hand over the newly bought pearl to Mrs. Sasaki, saying she had found it in her jacket pocket. Her hostess would accept it, and then try to fit it into the ring. Since it was a pearl of a different size, it wouldn't fit the ring, and Mrs. Sasaki, puzzled, would try to return it, which Mrs. Matsumura wouldn't accept. Mrs. Sasaki could only think that Mrs. Matsumura was acting to protect someone else. No doubt Mrs. Matsumura saw one of the other three ladies steal the pearl. It would be better to forget the whole matter. But at least I can be sure that Mrs. Matsumura is entirely innocent. Who has ever heard of a thief replacing something with a similar and more valuable item? With this stratagem, Mrs. Matsumura intended to escape forever from the infamy of suspicion and likewise, from a small expense, the pangs of an uneasy conscience. Returning to the other ladies. Already at home, Mrs. Kasuga still felt hurt by Mrs. Azuma's cruel joke. To free herself from such a ridiculous charge, she had to act before the next day, or it would be too late. To truly prove she hadn't eaten the pearl, it was necessary for the pearl to appear somehow. In short, if she could immediately show the pearl to Mrs. Azuma, at least her innocence regarding the gastronomic hypothesis would be firmly established. If she waited until the next day, even if she managed to produce the pearl, the shameful and unmentionable suspicion would inevitably arise. The usually timid Mrs. Kasuga hurriedly left her home, which she had just returned to, inspired by the courage that comes from acting impulsively, and rushed to a Ginza shop where she chose, and bought a pearl she thought was about the same size as the silver balls on the cake. She called Mrs. Azuma. She explained that upon returning home, she had discovered the pearl lost by Mrs. Sasaki among the folds of her obi bao, and felt somewhat embarrassed to go and return it. Would Mrs. Azuma be kind enough to accompany her as soon as possible? Inwardly, Mrs. Azuma thought the story was unlikely, but as it was a good friend's request, she agreed. Mrs. Sasaki accepted the pearl brought by Mrs. Matsumura, and, astonished that it didn't fit her ring, thought gratefully exactly what Mrs. Matsumura had intended her to think. She was surprised, however, when an hour later Mrs. Kasuga arrived, accompanied by Mrs. Azuma, and returned another pearl. Mrs. Sasaki was about to mention the earlier visit, but stopped herself at the last moment and accepted the second pearl as calmly as she could. She had no doubt that this one would fit the setting, and as soon as her friends left, hurried to try it in the ring. It was too small. Faced with this discovery, Mrs. Sasaki was speechless. On the return trip, both ladies found it impossible to know what the other was thinking, and although their meetings were usually cheerful and talkative, this time they fell into a long silence. Mrs. Azuma, who acted with full knowledge of the matter, knew for sure she hadn't swallowed the pearl. She had simply declared herself guilty at the party to avoid an embarrassing situation for everyone. Especially, she had been guided by the desire to clear the situation for a friend who, by her restlessness, had transmitted a sense of guilt. What could she think now? Beyond Mrs. Kasuga's peculiar attitude, and the process of having herself accompany her to return the pearl, she sensed something much deeper. Perhaps Mrs. Azuma's intuition had pinpointed her friend's weak spot, and by discovering it, cornered her, transforming an unconscious and impulsive kleptomania into a serious mental disorder. For her part, Mrs. Kasuga still harbored suspicions that Mrs. Azuma had indeed swallowed the pearl, and that her confession at the party was true. If so, it would be unforgivable for Mrs. Azuma to have mocked her so cruelly. Her timidity had contributed to the panic that had driven her to that little farce, and to spend a good sum. Wasn't it, then, a cruelty on Mrs. Azuma's part, after all that, to refuse to admit she had eaten the pearl? If Mrs. Azuma's innocence was pretended, Mrs. Kasuga, by playing her part so diligently, would appear in her eyes as the most ridiculous of second-rate actors. But let's return to Mrs. Matsumura. Upon returning from Mrs. Sasaki's house, and having forced her to accept the pearl, Mrs. Matsumura felt somewhat relieved, and could analyze, detail by detail, the events of the incident. She was sure that when she got up to fetch her piece of cake, she had left her purse on the chair. Then, while eating it, she used paper napkins, so there was no need to open her purse to get a handkerchief. The more she thought about it, the less she remembered opening her purse, until the moment she powdered herself in the taxi. How could the pearl have gotten into a closed purse? At that moment, she realized the absurdity of not having considered this simple detail instead of being frightened when she found the pearl. At this point in her reasoning, a sudden thought left her stunned. Someone had placed the pearl in her purse with absolute premeditation, intending to implicate her. And of the 4 guests at the gathering, the only one who could have done it was undoubtedly the detestable Mrs. Yamamoto. With eyes blazing with anger, Mrs. Matsumura went to Mrs. Yamamoto's house. Saying her appear at her door, Mrs. Yamamoto immediately knew what had brought her there, and prepared her defense. From the first moment, Mrs. Matsumura's interrogation was unexpectedly severe, and made it clear she would not accept evasions. "It was you." "No one else could have done such a thing," began Mrs. Matsumura. "Why me?" "What proof do you have? I suppose if you're coming to accuse me, you must have all the evidence, right?" Mrs. Yamamoto maintained a rigid composure. Mrs. Matsumura responded that Mrs. Azuma, having nobly taken the blame for what happened, could have no relation to such a vile act, and as for Mrs. Kasuga, she lacked the courage for such a dangerous game. That left only one suspect, Mrs. Yamamoto. She remained silent, her mouth closed like an oyster. Before her, the pearl brought by Mrs. Matsumura gleamed softly. The carefully prepared Ceylon tea was beginning to cool. "I didn't think you hated me so much," Mrs. Yamamoto dabbed at the corners of her eyes, but it was evident that Mrs. Matsumura was determined not to be softened by tears. "Well, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd say," Mrs. Yamamoto continued. "I won't mention names, but one of the guests. Are you referring to Mrs. Kasuga or Mrs. Azuma? Please, at least let me omit the name. As I said, one of the guests was opening your purse and putting something in it when I inadvertently looked that way. You can imagine my confusion. Even if I had felt capable of warning you, I wouldn't have had the chance. I began to feel palpitations, and more palpitations. And in the taxi ride, oh, what a horror not being able to tell you. If we had been good friends, I wouldn't have hesitated to tell you frankly, but since apparently you don't like me, I understand. You've been very considerate, and now you're skillfully putting the blame on the ladies present, right? Blame another? How can I make you understand my feelings? I only wanted to avoid hurting anyone. All right. But you didn't mind hurting me, did you? At least you could have mentioned all this in the taxi. I probably would have if you had had the frankness to show me the pearl when you found it in your purse. Instead, you chose to get out of the car without saying a word. For the first time, Mrs. Matsumura didn't know how to respond. Do you understand, then, what I wanted to do? The important thing was not to hurt anyone. Mrs. Matsumura felt an intense rage. If you're going to feed me a series of lies like this, I'm going to ask you to repeat them tonight in front of Mrs. Azuma and Mrs. Kasuga, and in my presence. Hearing this, Mrs. Yamamoto broke down in tears. Thanks to you, all my efforts not to hurt anyone will fail, she sobbed. For Mrs. Matsumura, it was a new experience to see her cry, and although she firmly told herself she wouldn't be fooled by those tears, she couldn't avoid the thought that, with nothing concrete proven, there might be some truth in Mrs. Yamamoto's claim. To be more objective, if Mrs. Yamamoto's story was accepted as true, her refusal to reveal the culprit's name indicated a certain nobility of soul. Likewise, it couldn't be certain that the gentle and seemingly timid Mrs. Kasuga couldn't be inclined to a malicious act. Similarly, the undeniable aversion between her and Mrs. Yamamoto could, depending on how one looked at it, be considered an extenuating circumstance for Mrs. Yamamoto's guilt. We have different natures, Mrs. Yamamoto continued through tears, and I can't deny there are things about you that I don't like. But despite everything, it's awful that you can suspect I need to resort to such a low trick against you. Pentad. And we say. Nevertheless, on second thought, submitting to your accusations will be the best way to show what I've felt about this matter. This way I'll bear the blame alone, and no one else will be hurt. After this pathetic speech, Mrs. Yamamoto bowed her head over the table and surrendered to uncontrollable weeping. Watching her, Mrs. Matsumura began to reflect on her impulsive behavior. Letting herself be blinded by her antipathy toward Mrs. Yamamoto, she had lost the necessary calm to handle her punishment. When, after prolonged sobbing, Mrs. Yamamoto lifted her head again, the pure and remote expression of her face became visible even to her visitor. A little scared, Mrs. Matsumura stiffened against the back of the chair. This should never have happened. When it disappears, everything will remain as before. Speaking enigmatically, Mrs. Yamamoto shook her beautiful hair and fixed a terrible, though fascinating, gaze on the table. In a second she grabbed the pearl in front of her and, with great determination, put it in her mouth. Raising the cup with her little finger elegantly extended, she swallowed the pearl with a sip of cold Ceylon tea. Mrs. Matsumura watched with horrified fascination. Everything had happened without giving her time to protest. It was the first time she had seen someone swallow a pearl. Moreover, in Mrs. Yamamoto's behavior, there was something of the desperation one supposes can grip those who ingest poison. However, though the act was heroic, it was no more than a touching incident. Mrs. Matsumura found that not only had her anger evaporated, but the purity and simplicity of Mrs. Yamamoto now made her consider her a saint. Mrs. Matsumura's eyes also filled with tears, and she took Mrs. Yamamoto's hand. "Please forgive me," she said. "I was wrong." They cried together for a long time, and twined their fingers, and vowed to be the best of friends from that moment on. When Mrs. Sasaki learned that the strained relations between Mrs. Yamamoto and Mrs. Matsumura had significantly improved, and that Mrs. Azuma and Mrs. Kasuga had cooled their long-standing friendship, she couldn't make sense of it, and merely thought that anything was possible in this world. Anyway, being a woman without too many scruples, Mrs. Sasaki asked a jeweler to remodel her ring to fit 2 new pearls, one large and one small, and wore it without further incident or embarrassment. Soon, she had forgotten the turmoil of that birthday, and when someone asked about her age, she replied with the eternal lies as always. The end.